Thank you for joining me today, Michelle.
Thanks for having me, Zack.
So you see a growing interest in these dividend strategies. Why is that?
Well, firstly, they're very easy to understand. Dividends are a very tangible and intuitive way for investors to understand what their investment is worth. In other words, there's this growing income stream into perpetuity that they can expect to receive. Secondly, when you screen for the very reliable and consistent dividend payers, you tend to get a basket of companies that are very robust and stable. So there's this quality filter. And thirdly, as we all know, cash is king. So there's a long string of famous investors that prioritize cash flow metrics when analyzing investments. And this is because cash flow is very difficult to manipulate, and cash flow difficulties are usually one of the first warning signs that a company is in difficulty. So effectively, these dividend strategies are giving investors access to these trusted investment principles for a very low cost. So the S&P Dividend Aristocrats South African index that we track at CoreShares has outperformed the general equity category consistently over some years, and it costs 1/3 of the average price of funds in that category. And the yield of the strategy is better than 94% of the other funds in that basket. So effectively, you're getting better performance and better yield for a lower cost. That's why they're popular.
So we're seeing an interest in the income stream, but also the upside participation, downside protection, as well as inflation protection from these strategies. But are all these strategies exactly the same, or do you get different dividend strategies?
You absolutely get different strategies, and that's a great question because investors need to understand the difference. So in South Africa, we mainly have two types. The first type is a high yield dividend strategy. So effectively, these strategies are screening for companies that have got the highest projected 1 year forward dividends. Here, you sometimes get companies included in the screen that have got a low price, and that's why they have a high dividend yield. So you almost get more of a value type filter to the companies in this bucket. The second type is screening for companies that have got very stable and consistent long-term dividend histories. And here you're getting companies that are robust and stable, type of non-cyclical earnings, that tend to be more consumer staples, that people are going to buy those products regardless of what kind of a meltdown the financial markets are in. And so that's almost more of a quality type filter. At CoreShares, we prefer that strategy, the consistent and stable dividend strategy. And here you tend to filter for all the household names that we all know and trust. So names like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Nestle, Dulux, Lindt. In a South African context, it's things like Mediclinic, Truworths, Mr. Price, Spar, ShopRite, names like that.
Okay, so one of those filters I know in the South African dividend index is that a company needs to pay dividends for 7 years in a row, but increasing dividends. And in the Global Dividend Aristocrats, that number goes up to 25 years in a row that dividends needs to be delivered at an increasing rate or stable rate. So a very good metric to include into a dividend strategy.
Absolutely. This should give investors a lot of comfort, and a good example is a name like McDonald's. Since 1977, they have grown their dividend year on year, regardless of any of the financial crises the world has been through since then. And they're included in the index. So what you tend to get is this sort of a defensive tilt, if you like. So you do miss a small part of the upside, but you've got a good amount of protection on the downside, as you said. So for example, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, the S&P 500 lost 37%, but the Dividend Aristocrats US index only lost 22%. So it's a good cushion there for investors.
And I can see why advisors and pension funds are interested in this, but how do they exactly gain access to that? Are they preferring ETFs in this space?
There are a lot of advisors using ETFs. ETFs are great because they are so cost effective and efficient. They're appropriate for retail investors logging on from home. They're appropriate for large institutional investors, and they are the same price for everyone. Looking at these specific strategies, advisors and especially the post-retirement market are using them to get a stable income They're good as a long-term holding because of the non-cyclical nature of the earnings of these companies. They tend to outperform, market cap strategies over a long-term time horizon. So, for longer-term holdings, these products work very well, and they can also work well alongside a traditional market cap strategy as a diversification, because the sector tilts are quite different. So you can imagine that with a dividend strategy, you're going to exclude the type of companies that tend to reinvest their free cash flows. So those typical growth companies like fast-growing IT companies, they would be excluded. So in the Global Dividend Aristocrats, IT is only 5%, while in MSCI World, IT is 16%. So actually the two strategies can work quite well together as diversification.
So we also see that you run a Global Dividend Aristocrat strategy. Do investors get anything more from a global dividend strategy that they don't get from a South African dividend strategy?
They do, because in fact, most South African investors are very overexposed to the South African economy in general, let alone in their investments. So it is really prudent to include some global investments for diversification as a rand hedge. The Global Dividend Aristocrats Index has 275 companies, and there you're screening for the most stable and reliable companies, as we discussed before. And when South African investors take money offshore or look for international investments, it is because they're looking for a safe pair of hands. It's almost their kind of nest egg that they're taking offshore. And this strategy suits that use case very well.
Great. Thank you for joining me today, Michelle.